Please welcome former Prime Minister, the Honourable Dr. Kevin Rudd.
I too honour the first Australians on whose land we meet and whose cultures we celebrate as the oldest continuing cultures in human history. I acknowledge in particular the representatives of the stolen generations who are with us here today, and to all our Indigenous brothers and sisters across the nation. And to all my Cabinet colleagues, parliamentary colleagues, past and present, Jenny Macklin and others, it's great to have you here as well. And Governor General, you do us a great honour by sharing this occasion with us too. And Michael McLeod, thank you for holding fast the flame these last 15 years. You are remarkable, my friend. It's been 15 years, that's quite a stretch. Good to see that none of you have changed. I certainly haven't. Hey Pat, how are you? That beard's the same as 15 years ago. It's taken me 15 years to grow this one, mate. So. It is good that we come together on this day each year. Friends, it was Martin Luther King who reminded us the arc of history bends slowly towards justice. Or to quote Dr. King more accurately, he wrote in the Gospel Messenger in 1958 that the arc of the moral universe is long and it bends towards justice. He carefully placed that phrase between inverted commas. In fact, the phrase itself predated Dr. King by 100 years, when it was first coined by the Reverend Theodore Parker back in 1853 as a rallying cry for the abolition of slavery on the eve of the Civil War. In our own country, Australia, we too have been on a long pilgrimage towards our own national mission, our own national project of national reconciliation with the Aboriginal peoples of this land. And viewed through the long lens of our national story, with each passing generation, that arc of history continues to bend slowly towards justice. We should remember that when Cook and Phillip first came to these shores, they were enjoined by the King to establish amity and comity with the Indigenous peoples of this land. What they found was not terra nullius. What they found was a vast continent peopled by an ancient culture extending back across the millennia, 60 to 70,000 years of continued settlement, more than 50,000 years before Caesar first arrived on a small island which later became known as Britain. Cook's original instructions from the British Admiralty in 1768 stated that, and I quote, "You are, with the consent of the natives, to take possession of convenient situations in the country in the name of the King of Great Britain." With consent, Cook was told. Phillip's instructions in 1787 commanded that, quote, "natives be treated with amity and kindness and given full protection of British law." Governor Darling was later enjoined especially to take care to protect the native inhabitants in their persons, in the free enjoyment of their possessions, and that you do all by lawful means to prevent and restrain all violence and injustice toward them, unquote. As you all know, across the bloody pages of settlement history of this country, it didn't turn out that way. According to an academic paper by Hunter and Carmody published in the Australian Economic History Review in 2015, between 1788, when the Aboriginal population was estimated at 800,000, and 1850, when it was estimated at 200,000, some 300,000 Aboriginal lives were lost in 1789 through chickenpox or smallpox. 180,000 were subsequently lost to other diseases, and 120,000 Aboriginal lives were lost to resources loss and conflict, including 20,000 directly killed. Furthermore, the University of Newcastle's Colonial Frontier Massacres Project has documented 410 massacres for which good documentary evidence exists in colonial sources, in which approximately 10,866 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders were killed. I grew up in a little country town in rural Queensland. It's called Yamundi. You may have heard of the beer, you may have been to the markets. About 10 kilometres away lies beautiful Lake Waiba. One of the streams feeding into this beautiful lake is still hauntingly called Murdering Creek, so named for the killing in cold blood of 25 Aboriginal people fishing by the lake at the hands of a group of white settlers from nearby Indigenous Station in 1862 who had lain in ambush for them. These stories are across our land if we care to look. The stains run deep and red across our land. And because of the frontier code of silence observed by white settlers across much of the land during the 19th century, we will never really know the full extent of these killings. This, my friends, is not what was once derided as the black armband view of history. Even less is it part of, quote, critical race theory, unquote, and the hysteria engendered by some on this. No, these are simple, hard, confronting, documented facts from the historical record. Of course, if we choose to look. For more than half a century, our national parliament, including both its major political parties, have wrestled with the righting of these great historical wrongs. It was the Menzies cabinet in '65 that first decided to repeal the racist provisions of section 127 of the Constitution, supported on a bipartisan basis by the then Leader of the Opposition, Arthur Calwell. It finally fell to halt to bring both this, together with proposed changes to section 51 on the inclusion of all Aboriginal peoples in the national consensus, to successful conclusion in the referendum of 1967. It's worth reflecting on what the then Liberal Prime Minister, albeit expressed in the paternalistic language of the time, said in his press statement of 28 May 1967. Holt said, and I quote him, "I was delighted with the overwhelming vote in every state of the Commonwealth favouring the elimination of those references in the Constitution that smack of discrimination. The grant of power to the Commonwealth in relation to Aborigines that follows from the vote will enable it to play a useful part in ensuring justice and social acceptance for people of the Aboriginal race. The vote will not only help the Aboriginal people, it will continue to Australia's and contribute to Australia's international standing by demonstrating to the outside world our overwhelming acceptance of the Aboriginal people within our community," unquote. While we will wince today at some of its patronising language, nonetheless, we, the Parliament, and then the people, through the 1967 referendum, brought about lasting change. The arc of history indeed bends slowly towards justice. And so it has been for the 5 decades since then. For Whitlam, the challenge was to respond to the real-world question of land rights of the Northern Territory, and for the nation at last to enact the Racial Discrimination Act as a new head of power for the Commonwealth to protect Aboriginal Australians and others from any form of discrimination based on the colour of their skin. For Keating, it was respond to the question of land rights for the nation at large, not just in the territories. When Brennan, the Chief Justice, writing the majority opinion for the High Court in Mabo, overturned terra nullius and affirmed the continuing existence of unextinguished native title. For me, it was responding to the Bringing Them Home report on the stolen generations, which had been gathering dust on the shelves of this Parliament for more than a decade after Keating had first commissioned it. Once again, with this series of actions by this Parliament, the arc of history has been bending slowly towards justice. Many doubts were raised about the Bringing Them Home report. Some asked, why should we apologise today when all these things were done in the distant past? Well, not really. Children were still being placed forcibly into church and state institutions well into the 1970s, and that is not exactly ancient history. But beyond the arbitrary proximity of time and responsibility, we should perhaps reflect on this. If we as a people and a parliament were happy and are happy to own and appropriate the acclaimed achievements of our more distant past, for example, the heroism of Anzac, despite the fact that none of us were actually on the shores of Gallipoli in 1915, and those who were have long since passed away, then by the same measure and equal measure, we should also be prepared to own and accept the darker chapters of our nation's story. We can't have it both ways. Through the process of selective historical memory, when the uncomfortable history of 410 documented massacres are willfully erased from popular and political consciousness. Put simply, it's the mark of a mature nation and a mature people when we recognise from the past both the good and the bad. There was another reason for the apology as well. The question I posed to the nation that day was a stark one. What if that which had happened to Indigenous Australians had happened to those of us who are white Australians? What if the children of white Australians had simply been ripped away from their parents without cause, without any case-specific evidence of maltreatment, but simply as a matter of general policy? How would we feel? Our reaction would have been outrage and anger and the deepest sense of injustice. So too should it be today if we were to put ourselves in the shoes of our Indigenous brothers and sisters, our fellow Australians. But there was a further reason for the apology as well. Aboriginal people themselves wanted it done. They wanted to hear the simple word, sorry. Remember the long decade of the sorry marches across the bridges of our capital cities? Delivering a formal national apology in this place was part of healing the profound emotional wounds of the past, rather than simply sweeping them under the national carpet. The apology did not solve everything, nor did the national strategy of closing the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians that I announced the same day. We have seen both progress and regress in each of the Closing the Gap annual report cards delivered each year to the Parliament since then. Although again I argue it's the mark of a mature nation to measure both our successes and our failures. Ask, for example, the 1,000+ Aboriginal kids who have benefited so far from the Australian Indigenous Education Program, who now work as doctors, as lawyers, as engineers, as nurses, as tradesmen, as entrepreneurs. Whether the gap is closing for them, and you will find that for many it is. Ask also the kids who are among the first to have universal access to early childhood education under Closing the Gap. But so too should we ask why we continue to see the incarceration of so many Indigenous kids, as Jeff McMullen reminded us before. Success and failure. Let us have the honesty and the courage to acknowledge both. The arc of history is still bending towards justice, however imperfectly, however unevenly, however slowly. This brings us to the next stage in our long march towards reconciliation, constitutional recognition, the voice, and the upcoming referendum on the same. Let me offer you a small word of encouragement amidst the customary tumult of this place, of which I have keen and sharp memory. Prior to the apology, there was a general fear, particularly among those who cautioned me against doing it, that we would be overwhelmed by a racist reaction. The truth is, it didn't happen. That's because the Australian people came with us. They were ready from right across the nation, country and city, big states and small, black, white and all shades in between. They came with us. That's because the Australian people are a good and decent people, and with an intrinsic instinct for a fair go for all. They had concluded in their own hearts and minds that Aboriginal Australia hadn't been given a fair go at all, and they wanted it fixed. That was it. That's the thing with big social reforms like the one you are contemplating today in this Parliament and we are contemplating across the nation with the referendum. It always looks much harder before the event than after. Much more frightening in the anticipation than in the execution. So it was with the apology, and so it will be with this referendum. As in 1967, the Australian people support constitutional recognition for the first Australians. It passes the pub test. It simply recognises an historical fact, and it does so with humility and respect. As for its partner reform, The Voice, it seeks simply to give practical effect to this constitutional recognition of the first Australians by providing them with an advisory body to this Parliament. Not a third chamber. Chambers have legislative power. This does not. It simply advises, advice which may be accepted or rejected by the executive or the legislature of the time. Constitutional recognition and the national advisory body that will be The Voice are two sides of the same coin. And the currency of which that coin is part is the continuing national mission we all support and share in this place. The realisation one day of a fully recognised Australia, a fully reconciled Australia, a fully united Australia. There is a further reason for this referendum to succeed. As with the apology, our Indigenous brothers and sisters have requested it. The Uluru Statement commands our respect. It is, as its authors wrote, a statement from the heart. And given what Indigenous Australians have been through across the long centuries since European settlement first began, are we now to be so hard of heart that we simply ignore it? Echoing Holt's reflections 55 years ago, I shudder to think what the reaction will be across the world were this referendum to fail. If we are seen to turn our back on so simple a request from those who have been the custodians of this ancient land since the Dreamtime. Constitutional recognition, The Voice, and the outcome of this referendum will not have an impact on the lives of 25 million Australians, but it will offer dignity, hope, and the possibility of change for the nearly 1 million Australians who belong to our First Nations. As it was with the 1967 referendum, with Whitlam and Lingiari, Keating and Mabo, and the apology and closing the gap. And with this year's referendum, I believe the arc of history will still be bending towards justice. Dr. Martin Luther King also reminded us of something else. He said just before he was murdered, he said, for those who always seem to urge near permanent delay because the time is not yet quite ripe. Dr. King said, the time is always right to do what is right. You see, we never know how much time we have in this place. We never know how much time we have on this earth. So for us, for this generation, and for Indigenous Australians today, as we approach this great national referendum, that time is now. I thank you.